On my 40th birthday, Mom stood up to give a toast but instead revealed a family secret that explained why I'd always felt like an outsider in my own home. The party was in full swing when it happened. I was sitting at the head table looking around at all the faces that had gathered to celebrate 4 decades of my existence when Mom suddenly pushed back her chair and stood up. The room gradually quieted as people noticed her rising, champagne glasses pausing halfway to lips, conversations trailing off into expectant silence. I thought she was going to give one of those typical birthday toasts that mothers give, something about how proud she was, how fast time had flown, maybe an embarrassing story about my childhood. Instead, she cleared her throat, her hands visibly shaking as she gripped the back of her chair for support. The words that came out of her mouth hit me like a physical blow. She told everyone in that room, with tears streaming down her face, that I wasn't her biological child. That she had taken me from a hospital when I was just days old because she couldn't have children of her own and was desperate to be a mother. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears as I stared at her, trying to process what she just said. My aunt's wine glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor, but nobody moved to clean it up. My cousins were frozen in place, their faces showing a mixture of shock and horror that probably mirrored my own. Everything suddenly made sense in the most terrible way possible. Why I'd always felt different from the rest of the family. Why certain family photos seemed staged, why I never quite looked like anyone else. Why Mom had always seemed to keep me at arm's length like she was afraid to get too close. Why there were no baby pictures of me in the hospital, why she always changed the subject when I asked about my birth. My whole life felt like it was crumbling around me. Every memory, every moment of feeling like I didn't quite belong, every time I'd wondered why I felt so disconnected from the woman who raised me, it all suddenly had this horrible explanation. I wasn't just imagining the distance between us. I wasn't being oversensitive or difficult. I was literally stolen from my real family. The practical implications started hitting me in waves. Somewhere out there were people who had been searching for me for 40 years. Parents who had lost their baby and never stopped wondering what happened to me. Maybe siblings I'd never met. A whole other life that had been stolen from me before I was even old enough to remember it. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even breathe properly. The room was spinning and I could feel everyone's eyes on me waiting for some kind of reaction. But what do you say when your entire identity gets shattered in a single moment? When everything you thought you knew about yourself turns out to be built on a lie? Mom was still standing there, still crying, saying something about how she was ready to face the consequences, how she'd already contacted the authorities and was prepared to accept whatever punishment was coming. She kept apologizing over and over, saying she never meant for it to go on this long, that she'd been living with the guilt for decades. Then something shifted in her expression. Her crying intensified, but it was different somehow. She looked around the room at all the horrified faces staring back at her, and suddenly she was shaking her head frantically. That's when she broke down completely and admitted she was lying. The whiplash of emotions was almost worse than the original revelation. Relief mixed with rage, mixed with confusion, mixed with a kind of exhaustion that went down to my bones. She collapsed back into her chair, sobbing uncontrollably, and the real truth started spilling out. She told us all about the severe depression she'd experienced after I was born. How she'd felt like a failure as a mother because she couldn't connect with me immediately the way she thought she should. How she'd spent years believing there was something fundamentally wrong with her maternal instincts. How the guilt and shame had built up over 4 decades until she convinced herself that making up this elaborate story would somehow explain everything and earn her the forgiveness she'd been too afraid to ask for directly. The room was still silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. People were processing this second revelation, trying to understand how someone could make up something so devastating as a way to explain their parenting struggles. I was trying to understand it myself. Looking back on my childhood through this new lens, I could see the signs of her struggle everywhere. The way she'd sometimes stare at me with this lost expression, like she was trying to figure out how to love me properly. The times she'd seemed to force herself to be affectionate, like she was following some script of how mothers were supposed to behave. The underlying sadness that I'd always sensed in her but never understood. Update 1. The days following my birthday party were some of the strangest of my life. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Family members didn't know how to react to Mom's confession about her depression and her lie about kidnapping me. Some people left the party early, unable to process what had just happened. Others stayed and tried to act like everything was normal, which somehow made it worse. I went home that night feeling completely hollowed out. Not because I'd been kidnapped, that relief was enormous, but because I finally understood the root of something I'd been feeling my entire life. The distance between my mother and me wasn't imaginary. It was real and it had shaped everything about our relationship. I spent the next few days oscillating between anger and sympathy. Angry that she'd put me through that horrific few minutes of believing I was stolen from my real family. Angry that she'd made my birthday party about her crisis instead of just talking to me privately. But also heartbroken for the woman who'd been carrying this burden of inadequacy for 40 years. The phone calls started immediately. My aunt called to check on me. My cousins called to say they were there if I needed anything. Even my elderly grandmother called, her voice shaky as she tried to explain that she'd always known something was troubling my mother but never understood what it was. But the most unexpected call came from someone I hadn't heard from in over 2 years, my college roommate. She'd somehow heard about what happened through the family gossip network and called to tell me something that completely changed my perspective. She reminded me of a conversation we'd had during our junior year when I was going through a particularly difficult period with my mother. I'd been upset about feeling disconnected from her, and my roommate had said something I'd completely forgotten. That her own mother had gone through severe postpartum depression and had told her years later that the early years of motherhood had been some of the darkest of her life. This conversation sparked a memory that hit me like lightning. When I was around 7 years old, I'd found my mother crying in the laundry room. When I asked her what was wrong, she'd hugged me so tightly it almost hurt and whispered that she was sorry she wasn't a better mom. At the time, I'd been confused because I thought she was a perfectly fine mom. But now I understood that she was apologizing for something much deeper. I realized that my mother's struggle with postpartum depression had probably been much more severe than she'd admitted at the party. The way she'd fabricated such an extreme lie suggested someone who had been living with overwhelming guilt and self-doubt for decades. Someone who had convinced herself that her difficulties bonding with me were evidence of some fundamental failing rather than symptoms of a treatable condition. The more I thought about it, the more I remembered other signs. How she'd sometimes seem surprised when I showed her affection, like she didn't quite believe she deserved it. How she'd often deflect compliments about her parenting with self-deprecating comments. How she'd never seemed comfortable at school events or parent gatherings, always standing slightly apart from the other mothers. I also started remembering the good moments that I'd somehow overlooked in my focus on the distance between us. The way she'd sit with me for hours when I was sick, never leaving my side. How she'd drive me to activities even when it was inconvenient, never complaining. The careful way she'd help me with school projects, always making sure they reflected my own work rather than taking over. By the end of the week, I realized something that surprised me. Despite everything, I wanted to talk to her. Not to confront her or demand more explanations, but to finally have the honest conversation we'd somehow never managed to have in 40 years. Update 2. When I called Mom to ask if we could meet for coffee, the silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long I thought she might have hung up. When she finally answered, her voice was small and uncertain, like she was afraid I was calling to cut her out of my life entirely. We met at a small cafe downtown, the kind of neutral territory that felt safe for both of us. She looked like she'd aged years in the past week, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry. She kept apologizing before I could even sit down, the words tumbling out in a rush of guilt and panic. I had to interrupt her to get her to stop. I told her I didn't want more apologies. I wanted to understand what had really happened, not just at the party, but throughout my entire childhood. I wanted to know about her experience of becoming a mother, about the depression she'd mentioned, about why she'd felt like such a failure when, from my perspective, she'd done everything a mother was supposed to do. What came out in that conversation was heartbreaking. She told me about lying awake at night when I was a baby, feeling nothing but anxiety and exhaustion instead of the overwhelming love she'd expected to feel. About watching other mothers seem so natural and confident while she felt like she was fumbling through every day, afraid she was damaging me somehow. She described the isolation she'd felt, unable to talk to anyone about her struggles because admitting she wasn't instantly bonded with her baby felt like confessing to being an unnatural mother. This was in the early 1980s, when postpartum depression wasn't discussed openly, when mothers were expected to be grateful and glowing and instinctively nurturing. The most devastating part was learning that she'd spent years interpreting my normal childhood behavior as evidence that I could sense something was wrong with her. When I was fussy as a baby, she thought it meant I knew she wasn't cut out to be a mother. When I went through typical teenage phases of preferring my friends to family time, she thought it was because I could feel her inadequacy. She'd created this narrative in her head where her initial difficulties bonding with me had poisoned our entire relationship, and she'd been living with that belief for 4 decades. The kidnapping story, as crazy as it sounded, had felt true to her in some twisted way because it explained the distance she perceived between us. But here's what I hadn't expected. As she was telling me all of this, I started recognizing my own role in perpetuating that distance. I'd always been sensitive to her moods even as a child, and I'd responded to her anxiety and self-doubt by becoming more independent, more self-sufficient. I thought I was helping by not being needy or demanding, but I realized I might have been confirming her fears that I didn't need her. We both cried during that conversation, but they were different tears than the ones at my birthday party. These were tears of recognition, of finally understanding something that had been affecting both of us for decades without either of us being able to name it. Then she told me something that completely blindsided me. She said that despite all her struggles and self-doubt, watching me grow up had been the greatest privilege of her life. That even though she'd always worried she was failing me, she'd been amazed by the person I'd become. She said she'd been proud of me every single day, but had never felt like she had the right to take any credit for how I'd turned out. That's when I realized the cruelest irony of the whole situation. While she'd been torturing herself about being an inadequate mother, I'd been interpreting her emotional distance as evidence that I was somehow lacking as a daughter. We'd both been living with versions of the same fear, that we weren't enough for each other, and that fear had created exactly the distance we'd both been trying to avoid. Final update. The weeks following our coffee shop conversation marked the beginning of something I'd never expected, actually getting to know my mother as a person rather than just as the woman who raised me. It was awkward at first, like we were learning how to interact without the weight of 40 years of misunderstanding between us. She started telling me stories about her own childhood that she'd never shared before, about her relationship with her mother, about the expectations and pressures that had shaped her ideas about motherhood. I learned that her own mother had been warm but critical, always pointing out what could be done better, never quite satisfied with anything. It explained so much about why Mom had been so hard on herself, so convinced that her struggles meant she was failing. I also learned things about my own early years that cast everything in a different light. She told me about the nights she'd walked the floors with me when I was colicky, how she'd read parenting books obsessively trying to figure out what she was doing wrong, how she'd called her sister crying because she was afraid she wasn't cut out for motherhood. But she also told me about the moments that had sustained her, the first time I'd smiled at her, the way I'd reach for her when I was upset, how proud she'd felt when I took my first steps. She said those moments had felt like gifts she didn't deserve, which broke my heart all over again. The real breakthrough came when I started sharing my own memories with her. I told her about the times I'd felt most loved and secure, and almost all of them involved her in ways she'd never realized. The way she'd make my favorite soup when I was sick. How she'd always bought the exact right birthday presents without me having to ask for them. The patient way she'd help me with homework, never making me feel stupid when I didn't understand something. I realized that while she'd been focusing on her emotional struggles, she'd been demonstrating love through actions in ways that had shaped me profoundly. Her consistency, her reliability, her quiet support during difficult times, those things had mattered more than the emotional distance I'd sometimes felt. But the biggest revelation came when I started examining my own life through this new understanding. I'd always prided myself on being independent and self-sufficient, but I began to see how much of my identity had been built around not being a burden to anyone. I'd learned early to manage my own emotions, to not ask for too much, to prove that I was worthy of love through achievement rather than just by existing. It wasn't entirely unhealthy, it had served me well in many ways, but it had also kept me from forming deeper connections with people. I'd been so afraid of being too much for anyone that I'd never let anyone see me as fully human, with needs and vulnerabilities and messy emotions. Understanding this pattern led to one of the most unexpected developments of this entire experience. I realized that my romantic relationships had all followed a similar template. I'd been drawn to partners who seemed emotionally unavailable because that dynamic felt familiar and safe. I'd never had to risk being fully known and potentially rejected. My current relationship had been struggling for months before my birthday party, and I'd been attributing it to incompatibility. But now I saw that I'd been recreating the same emotional distance that had characterized my relationship with my mother. I'd been so busy protecting myself from potential rejection that I'd never given my partner the chance to actually know and love the real me. This realization led to one of the most difficult but important conversations of my adult life. I had to admit to someone I cared about that I'd been holding back, that my fear of not being enough had been preventing me from being fully present in our relationship. It was terrifying, but it was also liberating in a way I hadn't expected. The response I got was not what I'd feared. Instead of confirmation that I was too much or not enough, I found someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of honesty, who had been feeling shut out without understanding why. We started over in a sense, building something based on authenticity rather than my careful performance of being the perfect partner. Meanwhile, my relationship with my mother continued to evolve. We started having regular phone calls where we actually talked about our lives instead of just exchanging updates about weather and work. She started asking for my advice about things, treating me like an adult whose opinions mattered. I started sharing my struggles and uncertainties with her instead of always pretending everything was fine. The distance that had characterized our relationship for 40 years didn't disappear overnight, but it began to feel less like a wall and more like a space we were learning to bridge. We were both discovering that love doesn't always look the way we expect it to, and that understanding someone's limitations doesn't mean accepting less than we deserve. It means seeing the full picture of how they're trying to care for us. 6 months after my disastrous birthday party, we decided to have a do-over celebration. It was small and simple, just immediate family, nothing fancy. But when Mom stood up to give a toast this time, her words were completely different. She talked about learning that being a good mother doesn't mean being perfect, and that some of the most important lessons she'd taught me had been accidental ones about resilience and independence. She said that while she regretted the years she'd spent doubting herself, she was grateful that her struggles had led to this deeper understanding between us. She raised her glass and said that 40 years later, she was finally ready to celebrate not just my birthday but the relationship we were building together. It wasn't the dramatic, movie-perfect reconciliation that part of me had hoped for. It was better than that. It was real, and messy, and honest, and sustainable. We were finally seeing each other clearly without the filters of fear and expectation that had distorted our relationship for so long. Looking back now, I can see that Mom's breakdown at my birthday party, as traumatic as it was in the moment, was exactly what we both needed. Not the lie about kidnapping, that was just the dramatic wrapping paper around a much deeper truth. What we needed was for the secret to come out, the secret that we'd both been carrying about feeling inadequate and unloved and not enough for each other. Sometimes the truth has to explode before it can quietly reshape everything that comes after. Sometimes you have to lose the story you've been telling yourself about your life before you can discover what was actually true all along. And sometimes the people who love you the most are the ones who have the hardest time showing it, not because they don't care enough, but because they care so much that they're terrified of getting it wrong. My 40th birthday will always be remembered as the day my understanding of my family completely changed. But more than that, it was the day I started learning how to have real relationships with my mother, with my partner, and eventually with myself. It was the day I stopped performing the role of the perfect daughter, the perfect partner, the perfect person, and started figuring out who I actually was underneath all those carefully constructed defenses. The woman who raised me spent 40 years thinking she'd failed at the most important job of her life. But in the end, her supposed failure taught me something invaluable, that love doesn't have to be perfect to be real, that understanding doesn't have to be immediate to be profound. And that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the chance to finally stop pretending that everything is fine and start building something true instead.